Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Okay.
Today we're going to be talking about tears and compassion.
Interesting combo.
Right. And we actually have some fascinating sources to help us break it all down for you. We have a scientific study looking at the makeup of tears,
Okay.
and then a blog post that's trying to connect this to some spiritual ideas.
Cool. So where do we even begin with something like that?
Well, why don't we start with the science?
Sounds good to me.
So one of the sources you sent, a study called Effective Stimulus on the Chemical Composition of Human Tears, dives into, well, like I said, the makeup of our tears. And it turns out not all tears are created equal.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's super interesting. So apparently, tears from strong emotions,
Okay.
like, sadness or even like intense joy, they actually have more protein than tears that are caused by like irritants.
Irritants, like what?
Oh, like when you're chopping an onion.
Oh, so like crying during a movie is different from crying because of an onion.
Chemically, yeah. Isn't that wild?
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And it seems like our bodies actually have different ways of making those different types of tears.
Like a separate pathway for emotional tears, huh?
Exactly. And there's another interesting thing this study looked at. Manganese levels in tears.
Manganese? Like, isn't that in batteries?
I know, right? I usually associate it with, like, I don't know, steel or something.
Yeah. What's it doing in tears?
That's a great question. And scientists have actually been looking into that for a while. Now, this study found lower levels than some past research. But the fact that it's even in there at all,
Okay.
and at a higher concentration than in our blood,
Interesting.
suggests that it might actually have a specific purpose related to our emotions.
Wow. So, like, maybe manganese is involved in how we process feelings.
Yeah. Maybe it's like a chemical messenger specifically for our emotions,
That's a really cool idea.
right? It just shows you how much we still don't know about how our bodies and minds work, especially when it comes to something like crying.
Yeah, for sure.
But on top of manganese, researchers have also found that emotional tears have certain hormones in them.
Hormones, like stress hormones.
That's actually where that second source you sent comes in.
Oh, right. The blog post.
Yeah, Unraveling the Science of Jeevakarunyam, the mysteries behind emotional tears.
Okay, yeah. And that was trying to connect those tear hormones to some spiritual ideas.
Exactly. What were some of the key things it highlighted?
Well, specifically, it focused on these three hormones they found in emotional tears: prolactin, ACTH, and leucine and enkephalin.
Okay, let's break those down one by one. Prolactin, that's usually related to breastfeeding, right?
You're right. It's often linked to maternal care and bonding.
So what's it doing in tears?
Well, it turns out prolactin has a lot of different functions. Researchers now think it's also involved in regulating our emotions, dealing with stress, and even reducing pain.
So maybe when we cry, the prolactin is our body's way of trying to like soothe itself.
That's a really interesting thought, and it's actually something scientists are actively looking into. It could be that our bodies have a built-in mechanism to help us regulate our emotional response, especially when we're faced with someone else's suffering.
It's incredible to think that something as simple as a tear could be so complex, like chemically speaking.
Absolutely.
So what about those other two hormones you mentioned? ACTH and,
Leucine and enkephalin.
yes, what do those do?
Well, ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone if you want the full name, is a big part of our body's stress response. Basically, it triggers the release of cortisol.
Right, cortisol, the stress hormone.
Exactly. So finding it in emotional tears, it kind of implies that even witnessing someone else's suffering, like an act of compassion, could actually activate our own stress pathways.
Like even if we aren't the ones going through it directly, our bodies react as if we are.
It really seems that way. It just goes to show how connected we are to each other, even on a physical, biological level.
Yeah, that's a powerful thought.
Now, that third hormone, leucine and enkephalin, that one acts like a natural painkiller, kind of like endorphins.
Oh, endorphins, I've heard of those, like from exercise and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So the fact that leucine and enkephalin is in our tears, it supports the idea that crying could actually help to reduce pain, both emotional and physical.
So it's like our tears are helping us process not only our own pain, but also the pain of others that we see.
It seems that way. Like our bodies have this whole system for empathy built right in.
That's fascinating.
And speaking of connections, that blog post also talked about how prolactin might affect our sex hormones.
Wait, sex hormones, how does that tie in?
Well, it just highlights how interconnected everything is in our bodies. Apparently, prolactin can influence testosterone production in men, and in women, it can affect oogenesis.
Oogenesis, Now remind me what that is again.
Basically, it's the process of how eggs are formed and mature in women. Think of it like the female version of sperm production, but for
Got
eggs.
it. Got it. Okay. So prolactin, this hormone we find in tears, could potentially be involved in reproduction.
Yeah, that's the idea. Researchers are still figuring out the specifics, but the connection is definitely there.
It's mind-blowing to think about, honestly. Like shedding a tear and reproduction, who knew they could be related?
Right. But remember, this blog post was trying to connect all of the scientific stuff to spiritual
Right,
ideas.
right. It kept mentioning this term, Jeevakarunyam. What was that all about again?
So, Jeevakarunyam is a concept from some spiritual traditions, and it essentially describes this profound, melting of the soul that happens when you witness suffering. Basically, deep, genuine compassion.
Mm. So are you saying there might be a biological basis for that, for this melting of the soul? Like, could these hormones in our tears actually be part of that experience?
It's a really intriguing question to consider. If Jeevakarunyam is all about feeling a deep connection to others' suffering, and we now know that tears have hormones related to stress response, regulating emotions, even pain relief, well, it's not totally out there to think those physical responses could be part of that larger experience of empathy.
It's like science is giving us a whole new way of understanding these old spiritual
Oh,
concepts.
exactly. We're actually seeing the physical mechanisms behind these, deeper, more intangible experiences. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, definitely food for thought. And I'm really curious to see where else this conversation takes us. What do you say we dive a little deeper?
Let's do it.
All right, so we've been talking about the science behind tears, compassion, all these hormones, and how they all connect. But where do we go from here? Like, what does this understanding actually mean for us?
Well, when you think about it, we're basically talking about being able to consciously cultivate compassion. And that's a pretty big deal, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, if we could actually train ourselves to be more compassionate,
Right.
what kind of impact could that have?
Imagine a world where people are just better at understanding and responding to suffering. Can we see less conflict, more empathy-driven action?
Maybe even a more peaceful and just society overall.
Exactly. It might sound idealistic, but it's not impossible.
So you're saying this scientific understanding, it's like a roadmap to actually making that happen.
That's the exciting part. By understanding how these biological mechanisms work,
Mm-hmm.
we can potentially develop tools or techniques to strengthen those pathways.
So instead of just wishing for a more compassionate world, we could actually work towards it.
Exactly. And that could involve all sorts of things like mindfulness practices, therapy, even educational programs.
Hmm. That's pretty cool.
Hmm.
But are there any, downsides to this? Ethically, I mean. Is it okay to manipulate our biology to try and change something as complex as compassion?
That's a really important point, and it's something we need to be very careful about. We can't just go around messing with our biology without thinking about the potential consequences.
Right. Like, what if we focus too much on boosting certain hormones and end up neglecting other important aspects of, like emotional intelligence?
Absolutely. We need to consider the whole picture. Things like self-awareness, being able to regulate our own emotions, even setting healthy boundaries, those are all crucial too.
Compassion isn't just about, feeling good or having the right hormones. It's about taking action.
Exactly. It's about having the courage to actually do something to help, even when it's hard.
It's about recognizing that we're all connected, that our actions have an impact on the people around us.
And that brings us back to that idea of Jeevakarunyam, that deep connection to the suffering of others.
Right.
It's about recognizing that compassion isn't just a fleeting feeling, it's a fundamental part of who we are.
Wow. This has been a really eye-opening conversation. We've learned so much about the science behind tears and compassion.
Yeah, and how they're both so much more complex than we might realize.
It's amazing to think that science is starting to give us a glimpse into these things that we used to think were purely emotional or spiritual.
And the more we learn, the more possibilities open up for creating a world where empathy and compassion are at the forefront.
Absolutely. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the science of compassion and tears. It's been a truly fascinating journey.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, we hope you learned something new today. Remember, every time you shed a tear, it's a reminder of your incredible capacity for empathy and connection. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep connecting.